The 2nd Century, Trends and Neighbors. Hello and welcome back to 202 Decades. This is the second installment of our brief end-of-century rest. Last episode, we went through a summary of the 2nd century and handed out some superlatives to the Roman emperors. This time, we'll discuss a key trend that permeated the past 10 decades and look at a couple neighbors of Rome. Before we get started, though, I wanted to mention a few ways you can support this series. First, subscribing, rating, and reviewing this podcast on whatever app you use is a big help. Second, if you'd like to support the series financially, you can subscribe or make a one-time donation to 202 Decades on Patreon. And third, you can follow the 202 Decades of Western History Substack. There, you'll find the most interesting stories from this podcast in a more bite-sized format, with pictures and maps to go along. Anyway, thank you for your support. In this installment, we will be discussing the trend of provincialization during the 2nd century. That may sound like a made-up word, but it's a real word, and the Oxford English Dictionary records the first use of provincialization all the way back in 1866. What's it mean? Well, in this context, I'm using it to refer to the slow but continuous shift from Rome to the provinces of the empire. Shifting of what? Well, most things. Power, influence, wealth, culture, etc. The 2nd century saw the focus of the empire gradually expand to the periphery. And by the year 199, Rome was no longer the lone star of the show. Let's start with the emperors. The emperorship was increasingly becoming unmoored from the capital. When we compare the princeps of the 1st century from those of the 2nd century, I think the imaginary graph shows a clear trend of increasing time away from Rome. During the 1st century, emperors had gone on campaign with the armies, but these had previously been brief forays away from Rome. Returning to Rome was returning home. Claudius had visited Britain during the conquest, and Domitian had led the campaign against the Dacians. Yes, Nero took his tour of Greece, but that was considered a faux pas by the elite in Rome. But those are the three emperors who spent the most significant and intentional time outside of Italy. And these were all fairly brief excursions. During the 2nd century, emperors became increasingly comfortable away from the capital. Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius in particular. Emperors began to discover that they could rule just as well from anywhere as they could from Rome. Let's look back through the century chronologically. At the turn of the century, Trajan became the new emperor. Instead of rushing for Rome when his predecessor died, Trajan took his time touring the frontier. This, more than appearing before the Senate or entering the capital, was his priority. And then, during the meat of his reign, Trajan led the armies in 2 wars in Dacia and a prolonged war with Parthia. He spent a few years in the capital between all of this warring, but his behavior shows that he was eager to be out on campaign. It's not clear to me that he would have rushed back to Rome anytime soon if he had lived longer, either. Trajan's successor, Hadrian, takes the cake for ruling away from Rome. He spent a large majority of his reign on the move, ruling from whatever provincial town he was visiting. Instead of relying on the palace staff or traditional assistants, Hadrian packed up his own traveling imperial court and administered on the go. He could be just as connected to his governors from Bithynia or Egypt or Hispania as he could be from Rome. Hadrian's journeying proves that it was the emperor that was the center of the empire, not the Senate or any other vestibular institution of the capital. I mentioned last time that administering in this fashion, moving from place to place, wasn't maximally efficient. But Hadrian's problem wasn't his transience, it was his need to see things for himself. Micromanaging from up close. Anyway, moving along chronologically, we next come to Antoninus Pius, who was quite traditional in most ways, including spending nearly his entire reign in Rome. Next, we reach Marcus Aurelius. I think under other circumstances, we could have seen Marcus spend his entire reign in the capital. We actually saw this during the Parthian War that broke out at the outset of his and Lucius's reign. Marcus hung out in the capital while Lucius, quote-unquote, led the armies. But the necessity of circumstances led Marcus to abandon the path he might have taken if he had been given a reign of peace. No, Marcus had to deal with the Marco-Mannic invasions. Often he led the army personally. When he wasn't physically present with his legions, he stationed himself nearby. Usually at Carnuntum, but sometimes at Sirmium or Vindobana, all near the Danube and close to the action. He was able to run the empire just fine from there. He discovered the same thing Diocletian and other emperors would discover 100 or more years later. Rome was an inconvenient base from which to lead the armies or to defend the frontiers. It was a long way down the Italian peninsula, and even further from the frontier armies. Milan, Trier, Nicomedia, and Byzantium will prove to be much more convenient bases. We'll get to these shifts during the next century. We're going to see this trend of de-emphasizing the city of Rome come more and more into focus as emperors increasingly favor cities like these that are closer to the action. Marcus spent most of his reign out with the legions or nearby. When he passed and his son Commodus took over, Commodus quickly headed back to Rome, where he spent the rest of his reign. There's nowhere like Rome if you're obsessed with gladiators or slaughtering ostriches in the arena. Commodus's reign was entirely in Rome, or thereabouts. But he was such a bad emperor that rather than establishing new trends, future emperors avoided following in his footsteps. And lastly, there was Septimius Severus. It's true that he raced to Rome to claim the throne, but that was more to clear out the sham emperor, Julianus, than anything else. No sooner had Severus arrived in the capital than he left for the east. As a usurper, the capital was still important to him. It gave him a degree of legitimacy that the other claimants lacked. To claim to be emperor, one still needed to control Rome. Maybe not be there, but control it. Otherwise, rather than a usurper, a claimant would risk fracturing the empire into pieces. Here's what I mean. If someone in Gaul was hailed as emperor, but didn't rid Rome of the previous emperor, for all intents and purposes, there would now be two parallel states, one run from Gaul, the other from Rome. Once Severus controlled Italy, though, he quickly abandoned it to chase rivals. Italy, of course, was the old heart of the empire. Rome's first conquests, when it stepped from city-state to regional power, came through unifying Italy. Slowly, Italy became Rome, and as the Romans conquered the rest of the Mediterranean, the status of Italy floated above the status of all the other provinces. The rest of the conquests were provinces or clients, but Italy was special. During the 2nd century, though, that began to change. Apart from slowly losing grasp of the emperors, Italy repeatedly had its special statuses stripped. It was becoming, slowly, just another province. Hadrian is the key player here. You may remember he actually split Italy up into 3 parts. This was deeply unpopular in Italy, and the divisions were ended soon after Hadrian died. But in other spheres, Hadrian was more successful. In the last episode, I didn't choose Hadrian as one of the 3 best emperors, but I do think he could be the most influential emperor of the 2nd century, Severus excluded. His pet project was making the empire into a Roman commonwealth of peoples and provinces united in Hellenistic culture, ordered by Roman law and defended by the legions. In practice, that meant making all areas of the empire equal. Italy could not be higher than Greece, Gaul, or Syria. Nothing concrete came of this idea immediately, but it was a shift in attitude which later emperors followed. Part of Hadrian's leveling was adding more senators from the provinces. Notably, in the 120s, Hadrian added an Athenian aristocrat and a Spartan grandee to the senatorial ranks. It wasn't totally new to have senators from outside of Italy. Claudius had caused scandal by adding a few Gaulish nobles to the Senate in the 40s. But the proportion of native Italians in the Senate was shrinking. Another telling example of this is the presence of a clique of senators from Africa that I mentioned in relation to Septimius Severus. Albinus, his ally become rival, was also from Africa. The senators, governors, and even emperors were no longer solely Italian. Trajan and Hadrian were famously the first emperors from outside of Italy. They were still ethnically Roman, though. Their families had moved to Hispania in the past couple of centuries from Italy. With Septimius Severus, though, we have our first emperor who is of provincial blood, probably speaking Punic as his native language, and Latin with a slight accent. It wasn't just the elite. Citizenship itself was expanding to ever more provincials. Citizenship had been expanding outward in concentric rings from Rome for a while. After the Social War in 87 BC, the other Italian cities were granted Roman citizenship. Since then, there had been a slow trickle of citizenship granting to loyal foreign soldiers and provincial elites. Hadrian made wide use of the citizenship grants as he traveled through the provinces, with many new citizens adding his family name, Aelia, as their own. The children of citizens would become citizens too, so slowly over the past 2 centuries, a larger and larger proportion of the empire were now citizens. This leveled the playing field across the empire. Legally, there was no difference between an Italian Roman citizen and a provincial Roman citizen. This will become a bit of a moot point early in the next century when Caracalla, the son of Severus, grants universal citizenship across the empire. But we'll get there. One of the many privileges of being a citizen was being able to join the legions. As citizenship expanded outside of Italy, there had been a gradual de-Italianization of the legions. During the 1st century, the legions were still majority Italian. By the end of the 2nd century, Italians were a minority in the legions. 2 main factors led to this devolution. First was what I had just talked about. More and more provincials had gained citizenship, and many of them would have been eager for the pay and retirement benefits being a legionary offered. There was now a larger pool of citizens to pull from in the provinces. Second was the assimilation process that slowly took place among the legions. Imagine a young Italian man from Napoli named Publius who becomes a legion and is sent to Moguntiacum on the Rhine River. Publius serves there for the entirety of his 25-year career. A local woman at the market catches his eye. She's from a village a few miles away, of mixed Gaulish and German descent. Legally, at least at this point in history, Publius can't marry her yet. But they live together and have 4 children over the years. Because they're not legally married, Publius's children aren't born as citizens. When he finishes his service, though, he would then be allowed to marry, and oftentimes his children would be retroactively granted citizenship. Even before this, though, recruiters at the legionary forts often turned a blind eye for illegitimate sons of legionaries. Finally, in the year 197, the champion of the armies, Septimius Severus, allowed legally recognized marriages for the legions. The provincialization of the legions will only intensify from here. The reign of Septimius Severus really is a transition point for the process of provincialization. and many other trends too. He will degrade the status of Italy in 3 sharp ways. First, by stationing a legion in Italy not far from Rome. Since Augustus, no legions had been permanently stationed here. The lack of the army in Italy maintained the fiction that the peninsula was a peaceful civilian land, while the legions defended the frontiers and pacified the provinces. Now, a legion personally loyal to the provincial emperor, made up of provincial troops, was stationed just outside the capital. Overly aspirational senators take heed. Second, over the course of his reign, he will weaken many of Italy's tax and judicial privileges. Under his rule, Italians, especially the elite, were forced to pay more of their fair share of the tax burden. Meanwhile, they found themselves to have ever less control over local matters. Until then, Italy had enjoyed a great deal of independence in local policy under the administration of magistrates. But Severus reduced their power and centralized more authority under his own control. Third, Severus remade the Praetorian Guard. Traditionally, the Praetorians had been drawn from Italy and enjoyed a rather luxurious occupation that had a bonus of having a great deal of influence over the emperor. We've seen them crown some emperors and kill others. Even all the way back in the 40s, Emperor Claudius had been selected by the Guard. Severus, however, was cautious of their king-making. He disbanded the old guard and remade it not with Italians, but with provincial soldiers loyal to him. Increasingly, the Praetorians would also become less guard and more elite military force, which the emperor could muster in times of special need. This wasn't a black and white transition, though. The Guard had been active on campaign at least as far back as Domitian in the 80s, and even after Severus, the Guard will continue many of its emperor-protecting and informing duties. But the balance will shift toward special force. That's mostly a digression. The key point is that the defenders of the emperor, who himself was a provincial, were now provincial soldiers. Okay, that was a lot. Let me finish this section by summarizing what evidence we've seen of provincialization. The emperors were less bound to the capital, citizenship and senatorial membership greatly expanded out into the provinces, the army became increasingly provincial, and Italy's privileges were chipped away. Before moving away from this trend of provincialization, I think we need to move beyond what to why. Why were the provinces on the rise relative to Rome or Italy? Beyond the personal decisions of Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius. The biggest factor in the rise of the periphery was the very peace and prosperity delivered by the Roman state. With only a few exceptions, between Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, there was widespread peace across the empire. The exceptions were notable, but they were fairly local affairs, and most people in most places got along with their lives in peace. Similarly, corruption was at historical lows. During the Republic, especially the late Republic, the senatorial administrators of the provinces often used their offices to fleece the provinces for the sake of personal advancement. Taxation could be harsh and arbitrary. Since the Republic became an empire, though, usually the emperor was able to keep this kind of corruption in check. Ensuring this injustice didn't happen both made the provinces more loyal and cut off one source of senatorial power. There's always a caveat for anything I say, of course. Corruption was always hiding just out of sight. All it took to rear its ugly head was a dysfunctional ruler like Commodus. But in general, there was fair and good governance. With the Roman state imposing less of a burden, the provinces, especially the historically wealthy ones, began to grow wealthy again. All this peace and prosperity allowed the ancient civilizational heartlands of Greece, Syria, and Egypt to begin to raise their heads after 2 or 3 centuries of subjugation. And even Africa, the old home of wiped out Carthage, rose to new heights during this time period. At first glance, the increase in wealth and culture and prestige of these provinces might make you assume increased division would come. That wasn't really the case, though. Rome had been so successful in incorporating the elite into its own system that they preferred to compete on the biggest stage possible, the entire empire. This had always been Rome's superpower, incorporating new people into its system. As Roman legionaries conquered, the cities and kingdoms they conquered were not treated entirely as subjects, at least not for long. Instead, conquered people were given a stake in the empire. First, in Italy, after the Romans conquered their Latin neighbors, these Latin cities were given a share of the spoils of victory. It wasn't always as much as they liked, but it was something to keep them on the Romans' side. The same process expanded outward from Italy to Hispania and Greece and Africa and Gaul and Syria, etc. Everyone who was in benefited when Rome succeeded. Over generations, as we've already discussed, citizenship followed in a steady trickle to the elites of the provinces and eventually to those lower down in the hierarchy. By the 2nd century, an ambitious Greek from, say, Ephesus could either compete his way to the top of his local city council, or he could move to Rome and play in the major leagues. Or maybe a boy from Leptis Magna in Africa could follow in his uncle's footsteps and make a name for himself in Rome, maybe even become emperor. With the elites linked together by their shared Romanness, increased provincial wealth and influence led them to link closer together. Of course, as more and more provincials took part in the highest levels of the imperial administration, the resulting web of connections they created was, at least by a literal meaning of the word, less and less Roman. But Hadrian's dream of integration was happening. Maybe not in the idealized way he envisioned it, but the empire, all of it, was truly becoming a Roman commonwealth. Let's turn our attention now to the neighbors of Rome. At the end of the last century, we took a world tour and looked at the great civilizations of the time period, from Parthia to China to Ethiopia to Mesoamerica and to Peru. That was quite a trip, but we haven't saved enough credits yet to repeat it this century. We'll have to travel a little more modestly this time and hone in on the 2 closest and most dangerous neighbors to Rome, taking up 2 cardinal directions: a rival civilization to the east and barbarian hordes to the north. Some other neighbors deserve more time than we're going to give them: the Caledonians north of Hadrian's Wall, the nomadic Berbers living at the borders of the Sahara and Roman Mauritania and Africa, and the Arab tribes south and east of Arabia Petraea and Syria. But alas, our credits and our time are limited. We have only budgeted for the big threats. Setting out east across the Euphrates River from Syria, first we come to a handful of small kingdoms, notably Osroene and Adiabene, surviving in a dangerous buffer zone. Past these, in Mesopotamia and beyond, we come to Parthia. Over the past century, we've become fairly familiar with the Parthians and their Arsacid dynasty rulers. Yeah, I've been saying Arsacid, but I've been informed it's Arsacid. Anyway, some flare-ups of violence between Rome and Parthia occurred during the 1st century. Remember during Nero's reign when Corbulo led a brilliant campaign in Armenia? But overall, relations were more peaceful last century. In the 2nd century AD, however, Rome repeatedly went to war with Parthia. Each time, the Romans laid a beatdown on the Parthians. The legions entered the Parthian capital no fewer than 3 times, under Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and Septimius Severus. Unfortunately, we have very little of the Parthian perspective on these wars. In fact, we have very little at all from the Parthian period. This empire stretched from modern Syria in the west to modern Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east, to the Persian Gulf and Indian Ocean in the south, to modern Turkmenistan in the north. This last place being the old homeland of the Parthians. Despite its size, wealth, and military power that could often go toe-to-toe with Rome, we have astonishingly few records from the period. Much more is preserved from the prior Achaemenid Persian Empire or the post-Alexander Seleucid Empire, or from the later Sassanid Empire than from the time the Parthians ruled this area. Beyond artifacts, nearly all of our written sources come from their neighbors, mostly Rome, but actually some Chinese sources as well. So, what's been going on in the Parthian Empire during the last century? Well, again, we can really only rely on the Romans for most of our knowledge. So we know about their invasions, and we also know there were frequent civil wars. The Parthians were always more divided than the Romans, and their political system probably made civil wars more likely. A broiling civil war in the 110s made Trajan's invasion far easier than it could have been. At that time, the Parthian king of kings, Vologases III, controlled the east of the empire, but the provocations of the usurper Chosroes in the west helped inspire Trajan's invasion in the first place. The Roman campaign left Vologases' domains untouched, and by 129, he had defeated Chosroes and reunited Parthia under his sole rule. But then, Mithridates V, another usurper, rebelled, and it took Vologases another decade to stamp out this second rebellion. In the midst of the second rebellion, the Parthians had to deal with an invasion of Alans, a nomadic Sarmatian steppe people in the north, and the growth of the Central Asian kingdom of Kushan to their east. Vologases III died in 147, and the throne passed to his relative and, strangely enough, the usurper Mithridates V's son, Vologases IV. This Vologases IV was ambitious. He completed the reconquest of Charax, that Persian Gulf city that had been freed from Parthian rule by Trajan. Then, looking north, he invaded Armenia and crossed the Euphrates into the borderlands of Roman Syria. These provocations and the defeat of 2 Roman armies sent to stop them led the Romans to mount a full-scale response, led, on paper, by Lucius Verus. Really, Marcus Aurelius called the shots, and Avidius Cassius led things on the ground. We can skip a recap of the war except to say that the Parthians, after losing a couple of significant battles, retreated before the Romans. The metropolis of Seleucia was sacked, and Ctesiphon was occupied. When the Antonine Plague struck, the Romans retreated. The defeat in this war led to the loss of northern Mesopotamia, including cities like Nisbis and Dura Europus. In turn, the rulers of the fortress city of Hatra, which Trajan had failed to take, were elevated in status to become kings. Vologases IV lived on and continued to reign until his death in 191. A rebellion by Chosroes II broke out in the last year of Vologases IV's life, but his successor, Vologases V, soon stamped it out. Yeah, that's, I know, a lot of Vologases. As the year of the 5 emperors broke out in the Roman Empire, Vologases V threw his support behind Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria. Perhaps as compensation for Parthian support, Vologases V began to take more direct control of the independent states straddling Rome and Parthia. For both of these violations, Septimius Severus, after defeating Niger, launched raids into Parthia in 195, freeing the small kingdoms from Parthian influence, and in 197 he led his full campaign into the heart of the Parthian Empire and sacked their capital Ctesiphon. As usual, the Parthian king of kings fled and survived. The Romans occupied the north of Mesopotamia, but failed again to take Hatra, limiting their territorial gains. What I didn't mention, though, during the decade of the 190s was that Vologases V was facing challenges from within his empire. The kings of Media and Persis had both rebelled, perhaps taking advantage of the internal chaos caused by Severus's invasion. But Vologases V was a survivor, if nothing else, and he succeeded in stamping out these rebellions when the Romans had packed up. That catches us up to the end of the 2nd century. Let's take stock of the Parthian situation. The repeated Roman invasions had done great damage to the Arsacid ruler's prestige. Remember, Parthia was more of a patchwork place than Rome. A king of kings ruling over a series of lower kings. These lower kings had more power and connection to their kingdoms than, say, a Roman governor had to his province. So, when the prestige of the king of kings declined, the rebellion of one of these kingdoms was more likely and more threatening to the king of kings. Although the Parthian Empire and its prestige were on the decline, we haven't seen the last time a Parthian army will get the better of the Romans. At the Battle of Nisibis in 217, the Parthians will defeat, or at least stand their ground, against the legions. Still, the repeated humiliations, including the destruction of Ctesiphon and Seleucia, inspired rebellion. Reviewing recent Parthian history is important here because in just 24 years, the Parthian Empire will be no more. The kings of Persis will find themselves stronger than their Parthian overlords. In the 210s, Ardashir of Istakhr, the king of Persis, began conquering the territory of his neighboring kingdoms. His expansion might normally have been checked by the king of kings, but the ruler of the Parthian Empire was preoccupied quashing a revolt of one of his relatives. By 224, Ardashir had become so powerful that he defeated the Parthian army in battle and killed the Arsacid king of kings. He soon conquered the west of the empire and established a new state, the Sassanid Persian Empire. This new empire was dynamic, aggressive, and will pose a much more serious threat to the Roman Empire than Parthia ever did. Next in our survey of Rome's neighbors, we turn away from the sun and heat of Mesopotamia to the forests and marshes of Germania Magna. We've spoken at length of the Germans in this series, as it seems we encounter them facing off against Rome every few decades. Our very first decade saw the Roman plan of conquest of Germania Magna, the area between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers, come crashing down. The Cherusci chief Arminius and his coalition destroyed 3 legions in an ambush. A few years later, Germanicus invaded Germania and made the locals pay for the damage in honor and lives done to Rome. Light skirmishes followed for several decades until the year of the 4 emperors, when the Batavi tribe took advantage of the chaos and revolted. When Vespasian's generals put that trouble to rest, there was peace again for a couple decades. Domitian had to deal with the Dacians and their Sarmatian and German allies. The same can be said of Trajan, but on a larger scale. Then we get several more decades of relative peace until the reign of Marcus Aurelius, when trickles of raiders quickly turned into large-scale warfare between the Marcomannic coalition and Rome. That brief outline catches us up with the large-scale interactions. A few larger notes on this period, though. First, we should remember 2 things when thinking of the Germans. From the time of Caesar at least, there were many Germans living within the empire. The Batavi are the easiest example. When I say the word Germania, I'm usually referring to the German lands across the Rhine or Danube rivers from the Roman territory. But really, there were 2 provinces within the empire with Germania in their names, Germania Superior and Germania Inferior. Second, Rome was active in making alliances and keeping a close eye on the German tribes outside its borders. When Arminius betrayed the Romans, he and his tribe were supposed to be allies of Rome. They weren't faithful, but many others were. Rome used these alliances to play tribes off each other and keep some control, project some power outside its core territory. Being friends with Rome was often a lucrative deal. One criticism that is sometimes levied against Antoninus Pius is that he didn't spend enough energy doing this diplomacy dance with the German tribes. If he had done this, some people say, he could have prevented the Marcomannic Wars from ever starting. That seems like a hard thing to prove to me. He didn't know what would happen next, and I could be wrong, but I'm not sure he was any less intentional about the process than Hadrian or Marcus Aurelius prior to the war. Anyway, remember that there were many friends of Rome on the far side of the Rhine and the Danube. Another change that took place over the past 2 centuries was the slow and steady fortification of the Rhine and Danube borders. Starting at least as early as Tiberius in the 1st century, fortifications were built to defend from raids or invasions. Legionary camps, originally temporary structures, became fortified and permanent forts. In the corner of land between the headwaters of the Rhine and Danube, where there weren't significant physical barriers, several stages of limes were built. These were often walls, ditches, or other barriers to movement. All of these small fortifications probably stopped medium-sized raiding parties. Smaller forays might still be able to slip through, and very large armies could blow right through the defenses, as we saw King Balamar of the Marcomanni do. This is speculation on my part, but I wonder if the very defenses meant to protect the empire incentivized the Germans to form larger units so they could break through. The Germans, as a people, seem to have originated from Scandinavia or thereabouts. That's the story they told about themselves, and the Greeks repeat it. Slowly, they moved south to mainland Europe and then spread west and south and east. They had originally been mostly hunter-gatherers, but small-scale agriculture was more common than our sources suggest. They remained through these centuries a tribal people, living within networks of kin and clan forming larger structures. If you asked a German from across the Rhine who she was, she would probably not say a German, but she would tell you her clan and what tribe she belonged to. We've met a lot of these tribes over the last 2 centuries. The Chauci, Cherusci, Chatti, Batavi, Frisi, Semnones, Marcomanni, Quadi, Langobardi, Vandals, and probably a couple others I'm forgetting. Each of these tribes was split into smaller clans and family groups. At a higher level, it seems many of these tribes fell under larger groupings. One of these groupings may have been the Swabians. Roman sources in the late Republic and early Empire refer to some tribes, including the Marcomanni, who were the largest member of this group, and the Semnones, who appear to be leading members of this group, as members of the Swabians. I've not used this term because of its uncertain meaning, but occasionally the confederation led by the Marcomanni in the Marcomannic Wars is called the Swabian Alliance. It's not clear whether this Swabian category was a real thing that some Germans fell into, or whether, as some have speculated, it may have been just another name to describe all the Germans, which our Roman sources misapplied to only some of the tribes. Around the time of the Marcomannic Wars, the Swabi term falls out of use for about a century, before being picked back up in the 4th century. The name Swabi isn't the only name to fall out of use in the coming decades. We get a bit of a dark age when it comes to our sources from the Germans over the next half-century or so. When they re-emerge into the light of written history, we find great reorganizations have taken place. Gone are the dozens of small tribes. In their place are large coalitions. We may have seen a snapshot of this during the Marcomannic Wars, as the German tribes worked together for common interests. In the middle of the 3rd century, we will see new, larger groups emerge, names that are still widely recognized today. Some came from the combining and rescrambling of several smaller tribes, Alemanni, Franks, Saxons. Others were new arrivals onto the Roman stage, like the Goths. Subscribers to the Substack will here get a brief overview of each of these larger Germanic groupings of peoples. The movement of these newcomers, the Goths, seems to have been a key push factor in the coming conflicts and probably even the Marcomannic Wars. They had, over the course of centuries, moved down south and east from their Baltic Sea home. When they enter our story in the 3rd century, their home is along the north of the Black Sea coast in modern Ukraine. Living on the western end of the Eurasian steppe, they adopted several habits of their Sarmatian neighbors, from whom they had conquered the land: horsemanship and archery. Despite living on land usually inhabited by pastoralists, the Goths were predominantly an agricultural people. Living along the Black Sea will also teach them to be proficient seafarers. Using these skills, and with their large numbers, they will come into conflict with the Romans in just a few decades. Our abbreviated tour has come to an end here. We hope you've enjoyed your ride. Please be sure to tip your guide. That's it for this end of century episode. There is a lot more that could be said at the end of the 2nd century about larger trends. Economics, literature, and religion all stand out as topics I would like to say more about. But I'm also antsy to get back to the decades. I think that all 3 of these topics, especially economics and religion, are in a kind of halfway point at the year 200. In economics, we have inflation beginning to take a real toll on the Roman Empire, and coins become increasingly worthless. In literature, we have the growth of the Roman romance novels, and in religion, we have the growth of Neoplatonism and worship of the sun, not to mention the growth of Christianity. But if we check back in either at mid-century or at the end of the 3rd century, I think we'll be able to talk more about completed processes rather than the trends that are halfway to their ends. It won't hurt to allow these trends to bake a little while longer. So with that, I bid adieu. Next time, we get back to the decades, and we will see how Septimius Severus rules once all his rivals are gone. I'll see you next time.